So session 3 is entitled Transpacific Migration and Cultural Connections. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, Issei contributions to a number of industries in the United States, including agriculture, floriculture, logging, fishing, needle trades, and domestic work, have really shaped our understanding of the early Nikkei experience. Japanese values such as gammon have also become synonymous with characterizations of Issei. While these descriptions may accurately portray Issei life broadly, like all groups of people, they were not entirely homogeneous in their interests, experience, and backgrounds. Issei contributed to fields outside of these more well-known industries and lived much more colorful lives. Exploring Issei who operated outside of these characterizations, who were devoted to the arts and culture and religious life in their adopted home, provides a lesser-known perspective. So we have two scholars with us today who will go into more detail on this topic. So the first presenter is Dr. Emily Anderson, one of the curators at the Japanese American National Museum. And following Emily's presentation, we'll hear from Dr. Andrew Leung, assistant professor of English from the University of California, Berkeley. So we'll have a comment and discussion period at the conclusion of the session. So throughout the session, you're more than welcome to put questions or comments in the Q&A feature or in the chat. So now I'll turn it over to Dr. Emily Anderson.
Thank you, Kristen. Let's see if I can manage to share without too much trouble. Let's see. Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me to participate. I will not be talking about Wakayama today, but I would like to mention that the very beginning of my career at JANM, or the first portion of my career at JANM many years ago, I actually visited Wakayama on behalf of the museum when we did Henry Sugimoto Painting an American Experience. And hold on. Okay. And I was able to visit Wakayama, and we actually borrowed about I believe it was 7 paintings from the Wakayama Civic Library. So it's great again always to reconnect with Wakayama and the connections that we have institutionally, but also for me personally, Henry Sugimoto and working on that exhibit sort of changed the direction of my life and my career. So I always have this, this is just a reprint photo of Henry Sugimoto that we used in that exhibit, but it continues to have a place of honor in my home. This is Henry Sugimoto in Paris, looking very, very handsome and artistic in, I believe, 1932. The original photo is only this big and is in the JANM collection. But today I'm actually going to be focusing on what early Issei life was like in Los Angeles, and by focusing actually on church histories. One, because that's my own personal area of research interest, but also because I think it's a really under-examined source of information about immigrant life. So I will be talking primarily about two different congregations, and I'll use a couple of what I consider rather interesting anecdotes to look at how using churches as a source of information tells us a lot actually about Issei life in the early 20th century. But before we get to that, I wanted to just provide a very quick primer for everybody on immigration, Japanese immigration to the US, why it happened, and also how things in both the United States and Japan were changing. The overarching framework of this symposium and the multi-year project that the symposium is a part of is transbordering, or the fact that there are people moving not only from Japan to the United States, but back and forth, and who are actually living within a larger transnational context. And so the context of both the US and Japan are very important in us understanding those early circumstances. So this may feel like a bit of high school history, or returning to high school history. Then again, I was once a college history professor, and most of my students needed this the sort of refreshing of their knowledge. So hopefully this won't be boring and will be helpful context. So as you all know, oh dear, JANM is in Los Angeles in California, and in the mid-19th century, which is the most immediate sort of historical context that is important to us here, California was what we call California now was actually Alta California, or was part of Mexico, which was ceded to the United States following the 1948 war. So a lot of the southwest of what we now call the United States became part of US territory at that point. So, and very quickly, thanks to the discovery of gold in California, California went from a territory to a state incredibly quickly. And soon, because, and this continues to be true, right? California is a land of sunshine, and it was promoted to people living on the East Coast and the Midwest of the United States of a land of sunshine and healthy living. And while this had been part of Mexico and had, originally indigenous residents, and then Spaniards and then their descendants, but it was promoted as a place of healthy living and sunshine, especially for white migrants. Those are the people who are the primary targets of marketing campaigns, urging people to make the long trek westward to California. At the same time, also, the Kingdom of Hawaii was was sort of on the became an area of interest for first primarily American missionaries. These are Protestant missionaries who are just starting to venture outside of the United States. And then, of course, they're quickly followed by others who saw the Kingdom of Hawaii as a fertile place to grow and to sell what sugar. Sugar plantations became a major business venture. That's the US context. Meanwhile, in Japan, and this, of course, is a painting by Henry Sugimoto that says Beikokuiki, or Going to America. This is his depiction of a young Wakayama man with the Wakayama Castle in the background, with his parents bidding him farewell as he departs, presumably as a dekasegi worker, to go work in the United States. So just as things were shifting in the United States, and, once California had become part of the United States, people in the US are starting to look not only to that land barrier, but beyond into the Pacific, to the islands of the Pacific, and then across to Asia. Japan, which had limited its diplomatic relations with other countries and restricted its own subjects from leaving the country, was forced into a series of treaty negotiations with the United States. The U.S. used gunboat diplomacy led by Commodore Matthew Perry, and 1854, Perry was successful in forcing Japan to enter into relations for the first time with all but the Dutch in about 200 years. So Japan went from being very much closed off from as many outside contacts as possible to suddenly being forced open. Not only was it forced open, but that being forced open really undermined the authority of the ruling Tokugawa shoguns. And so a number of competing domains rose up, well, first united and rose up and toppled the Tokugawa shogun and established a new government. They claimed that they were restoring imperial rule, meaning they were putting the emperor, who had been the ruler of Japan since the about the 4th century. And the emperor had been around while there had been a shogun, but this new sort of group of samurai and domain leaders who had toppled the Tokugawa shogun put the emperor, the Meiji emperor, made him, at least by name, in charge and created an entirely new government and quickly established a series of quite astonishing reforms, because they realized that if Japan did not change a lot of things, it was in danger of becoming colonized by a Western power. The Americans, of course, were a major concern, but the Russians, the British, the French, the Dutch, not so much by this point, but they were concerned about being taken as a colony. So Japan went very quickly from being a closed off country that had not had outside contact, where people living within Japan were not allowed to leave the country. If they somehow accidentally left, if they were shipwrecked, for example, they were not allowed to return. Japan went from that kind of country to, within decades, becoming a place that had industrialized, had a modern banking institution, had a capitalist market system, had, by the end of the 19th century, a fully functioning parliament system with a prime minister. It was an astonishing series of changes that happened very rapidly. And so when changes happen, it unsettles what has been. And those changes may be great for some people, and they may be very disorienting and even economically devastating for others. And that's what happened in Japan. You had both people who embraced these changes, and it was an opportunity for success, and they sought leadership and pursued different opportunities. For others, they have been very settled and comfortable in the way their lives have been, and all of these changes happening so quickly, either just upset family dynamics or introduce new conflict. In some cases, in very practical ways, a shift in taxation systems caused a lot of people to go from owning small scale farms to becoming quite poor and becoming tenant farmers overnight. There are lots of changes, whether it was economic, ideological, in beliefs, any kind of change you can imagine. All those things happened. And when changes happen, that can also be a time of opportunity. And that's what happened in the case of a lot of Japanese people. So if you were a farmer, say somewhere in Wakayama, in Kishu, and Kishu, because it was on the side of the Tokugawa, it was a family. They were related to the Tokugawa family. And so you may have discovered that the amount of money that you had depreciated overnight, or maybe you realized that remaining where you and your family have been for centuries was not the best decision anymore, and you were going to send one of your children off to be educated elsewhere, or maybe work in a new factory. You could send your kid to a factory outside of Tokyo, or maybe you would send your kid to be a farm worker in California. If you were a small scale farmer somewhere in the middle of Wakayama, those two options may not have seemed that different from each other in terms of how different they were from the life that you have been leading up until now. Factory life or farming life, if those are your two options, perhaps farm work, even if it meant crossing the ocean, may have felt more familiar. In the first year, so in the Japanese system, the Gregorian calendar is used, but also there's a parallel way of counting the years that is based on the emperor's reign year. So, for example, what I'm talking about today all happened under the Meiji Emperor's rule, when the Meiji Emperor was the Emperor of Japan. That started in 1868. So in Japanese, you count the first year, you call it Gannen. It's the first year of that emperor's reign. And in that first year of the Meiji Emperor's reign, there was a group of laborers who were sent to what was then the Kingdom of Hawaii as contract laborers. Because they went in Gannen, the Meiji Gannen, the first year of Meiji, they became known as the Gannen Mono. that was a first effort that ended up not leading to much immediately. They mostly received very poor treatment, and there are no immediate subsequent groups were sent. Eventually, there were large-scale immigration begins by the 1880s. But in the meantime, there is a trickle of people who do go from Japan to the US, mostly not as laborers, mostly as students. Some were sponsored by the Japanese government to go study things that would benefit Japan's efforts towards modernization, industrialization. Some people went because they had their own American dream, whether it was to be educated in any number of sort of practical areas of knowledge, engineering, political science, or they may have wanted to study humanities. Some were independently wealthy, but if you weren't, those that were not often worked as domestic labor. They lived in somebody's home and provided some basic domestic chores, and that was how they were able to have a roof over their heads while they studied at the same time. Eventually, however, large-scale immigration does begin, and as has already been mentioned here, Wakayama was the sixth largest immigrant sending prefecture. Hiroshima and Okinawa were number one and number two, but large groups of immigrants left primarily southwestern Japanese prefectures, first primarily for the kingdom, and then eventually the territory Hawaii after the U.S. takes Hawaii as a territory, but then also they begin arriving in the U.S. mainland. In Hawaii, they primarily are working on sugar plantations, doing the very hard, physically demanding and uncomfortable labor of harvesting sugarcane to enrich the owners of these sugar plantations. And those who arrived on the US mainland were working in farming, which worked very well because most those people who were coming from Japan mostly came from farming backgrounds or fishing, as Sakurai-san has mentioned. Taiji, but many other fishing communities saw their, members of their communities leave for the US, for British Columbia, for Australia, to continue the work in fishing and fishing related industries, but also railroad and logging were very popular sources of income. So here, I'm just going to share very quickly before I get to the church part of my presentation. But here we just have some images of early immigrants. So we have railroad workers. Now, Chinese immigrants had built the main line of the the transcontinental railway that connects the west and east coast. But there's still a lot of spur lines that were left to be built, and also a lot of maintenance work. And so a lot of Japanese immigrants who came worked on these spur lines. So those are ones that were going off the main line or engaged in maintenance work. This is also grueling work, quite isolated work. And then eventually, though, as these men, initially mostly men who came thinking they're just going to come for a couple of years, as they either decided that they liked living in the US or they couldn't go back for a variety of reasons. Some didn't earn as much money as they thought they would. Some lost all of their money in gambling and other ill pursuits, which I will talk about more later. They started to settle down and go into their entrepreneurs who opened restaurants and laundries and stores where they imported foodstuffs from Japan to recreate some of the flavors of home. There were tailors and newspaper men. Of course, you can joke that if you get four Japanese people together, they're going to start a newspaper. And if you add another four, there'll be a competing newspaper. And this was true. Just about every area that had a sort of critical mass of Japanese immigrants had newspapers and poetry groups. And so slowly over the decades, you had a growing not just population of Japanese immigrants, but a sense of community. from farmers to shop owners. And amongst these, some of the earliest institutions were churches. Now, the majority population of immigrants at the time, I think probably over 70%, possibly over 80% were Buddhist. Nominally Buddhist, at least. In Japan, Buddhism is, or religion is sort of a thing that you deal with situationally. So few people, the classic sort of scenarios, if you were to give a survey in Japan about religious affiliation, most people will tell you that they are not religious. But then if you ask them about specific events, like for your grandmother's funeral, was it not religious? And they'll say, oh no, that was Buddhist. What do you do on New Year's Day? Oh, I do Hatsumode. I go to the local Shinto shrine. Were your parents married? And that could be Shinto, or actually quite commonly now, a Christian wedding, not because people are Christian, but because Christian weddings are considered more attractive than a traditional Shinto wedding. Traditional Shinto weddings are also only as about 150 years old. They were invented as invented tradition. Now, that is the case, but Buddhist churches actually were often founded after Christian churches were. I don't have time today to get into all of the reasons why, although if somebody would like to know more, please post a question in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll try to address it quickly. But to give just the Los Angeles example, in Los Angeles, the earliest religious institution was what is now the Centenary United Methodist Church, what was originally the Rafu Nihonji Mi Kyokai, or the Los Angeles Japanese Methodist Episcopal Church, which was formed, which had an identity by 1897, whereas the oldest Buddhist congregation was Higashi Honganji in Los Angeles, which was established in 1904. So Christian churches were among the first organized institutions, and I'm a scholar of Japanese Christianity more broadly, and so I'm naturally drawn to this topic. But also, I think it's a incredibly rich topic for anybody who's interested in Issei history, because they're among the earliest institutions. Also, churches keep records, and not every church was able to maintain their property or their records because of wartime incarceration, but some congregations were fortunate enough to have friend congregations, or renting, or sort of borrowing congregations take over and maintain their property during World War II. And so for those institutions that had somebody to look over their things, those records have survived. And I'm going to share just a couple of tidbits from a couple of those archival records. The other thing is that many of these Issei pastors publish memoirs. Pastors have a lot of things to say, and many of them are not done even after they're done with the podium. And these memoirs are incredible rich sources of information about what early life in America was like for immigrants. And also, these are fundamentally transnational spaces. Issei churches were operated entirely in Japanese until their children, the Nisei, were old enough to basically complain about having to listen to Japanese sermons. By the 30s, you would have a Japanese church service and an English church service, but up until then, Issei churches were run in Japanese. Their members were, Japanese immigrants. Their pastors, many of them were trained in Japan and came over essentially considering themselves missionaries serving Japanese immigrants. Others were immigrants who had converted in the US and been trained here in the United States. It also, because Christianity is, sort of supersedes any national boundaries, Japanese Christian immigrants also interacted with white Christians, primarily missionaries, who were assigned to serve immigrant groups. And so this is just by looking at the small group of people, you get a really interesting sense of what early Issei life was like. Okay, I'm going to, and then I just want to take a second to highlight our JANM's collection, because we have some phenomenal collections. These are archival collections, and they're also, with the exception of the American Friends collection, these are majority Japanese language collections. So certainly for any people who are joining us who read Japanese and who are interested in looking at Japanese language material. These are incredible collections. The West Adams Christian Church, which was originally just the Japanese Christian church. We have St. Mary's Episcopal Church, Reverend Paul Watanabe. We have his sermon notes. Again, these are in Japanese. And then the American Friends Service Committee, who maintained, collected these sermons given by ministers right before wartime incarceration, in addition to other things. So because of time, I'm going to just focus on one story, which is, so I'm actually not going to talk about the effort. I'm not going to go into great detail about the efforts to save the souls of Issei. I will just give you a taste. I'm actually going to tell you a story about ice cream. This is the West Adams Church. So this congregation here, the Bethlehem Japanese Mission, is a mostly forgotten congregation. I don't know when it was founded. But it's one of the three congregations that joined to form the Union Church, or the Godo Kyokai, which was established in 1918. So what I want to do is share with you just a brief anecdote, but it's an anecdote that I think actually is incredibly revealing, that appears in the memoir of Reverend Furuyama Gojiro, who was the minister of one of the other congregations. So there was Bethlehem Congregational, the Los Angeles Japanese Congregational Church, and then the Presbyterian Church. Those three congregations joined to form Union Church. So I'm just going to summarize this. So these two pages or the English text is just a translation of what appears here. In 1909, Reverend Miyagawa, who was the head pastor of the Osaka Kumiai Kyokai, or the Osaka Congregational Church, it had over 2,000 members. It's essentially what we would now consider a mega church. Reverend Miyagawa visited the United States and apparently went to Yosemite first, but eventually made his way to Los Angeles. When he got off the train, he was welcomed by church members of the Union Church, who picked him up, or it was the Congregational Church. He was picked up in a horse-drawn carriage, because this is 1909 and cars are not really a thing. It's an open horse-drawn carriage, and it's this a very important man's first visit. And also Miyagawa is the son of samurai, would have been a samurai had he been born a little bit earlier. Very proud and very distinguished, important man. So they drive him around Los Angeles to see the sights, and then they go to the church. And meanwhile, the women's group, the Fujinkai, had made ice cream. This is before there's motorized ice cream makers, so this is a lot of work. And he was supposed to give a sermon, but he looked very unhappy. And when Reverend Furuya asked him what the problem was, he said that after he'd been dragged around in the heat of Los Angeles in July, he could not believe that he was being asked to give a sermon. And apparently the ice cream did not improve his mood whatsoever. So Furuya, being a very clever man himself, said, "I thought that a person such as you is prepared to give a sermon at any time, anywhere, and that's why we welcomed you in this way. Please forgive us." So that appeased him, and then he ate the ice cream and proceeded to give a sermon. And while this seems like just sort of a random story, what I think this very odd incident illustrates is that already in this moment, you have the emergence of an Issei identity. That is, these are Japanese immigrants who have become accustomed to living in the United States. They are becoming Angelenos in a sense, and they are behaving and welcoming this person in a way that is already, there's already this tension emerging between this important Japanese minister coming directly from Japan and this group of immigrants who are living in Los Angeles. So there's not really much time to go in, but let me just end with this. So this is the Methodist Church, which is now Centenary United Methodist. It has returned now to Little Tokyo. It started in Little Tokyo and then moved and now is returned. This is a photo that's in the JANM collection as well from 1914. But I just want to end very quickly by with this. I'm not going to go into the content of the sermon. If you have heard sermons, the content will not be very unusual, but I think the place of the sermon is the Epworth League, which is the Methodist. It was a sort of a young, at the time it was a young men's association of Issei bachelors or young Issei bachelors, did street evangelism in Little Tokyo. And these records, these summaries or records of what the sermons were exists. It's part of the JARP collection at UCLA. The entire collection of the Methodist Church is there. And for those of you who are familiar with Little Tokyo, I want you to picture the intersection of First and San Pedro. So this is just a block away from where JANM is. If you can imagine 7:30 p.m. on Sunday evenings, a Issei man standing at that corner every week as other Issei are walking by him, preaching at them about avoiding the unseemly activities of excessive drink and gambling and going to brothels, and instead seeking the salvation that Christ brings. Again, the sermon content is no different from any sermon that you would hear. But if you can imagine the world that Andrew's about to describe to you, intermingled with this man preaching at other Issei men walking past him, I think just really gives us such a diverse and interesting and rich view of the world that the Issei lived in. So I know I'm a little bit over my time, so I will stop here.